WhatsApp has been a big deal for us. It is like the thing that has taken us from a place of thinking about church as event to church as like a family, that we are communicating with one another 7 days a week about things. And again, using the sort of filter or the lenses of our shared way of life for the way in which we're engaging one another in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Pivot Podcast, where we explore how the church can faithfully navigate a changing world. I'm Alicia Granholm, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dwight Shiley.
And our guests today are JR and Amy Roscoe, co-founders of Canton Abbey in Canton, Ohio, and co-pastors of Common Life Church. What they've built isn't a typical church plant. It started as a kind of missional experiment, rooted in the ancient idea of an abbey, a place where contemplation and action, prayer and hospitality feed each other. Over several years, Canton Abbey has catalyzed a range of community work: Easter parades involving dozens of congregations, county-wide Christian community development, calling, discernment workshops, and in fostering Common Life Church, a first catechism class, and most recently a baptismal service at a newly founded retreat center. JR and Amy have been thinking carefully about what it looks like to draw on the deep wells of Christian tradition in ways that actually form people in faith, rather than just inform them about it. JR and Amy, welcome to the Pivot Podcast.
Thanks, Dwight. Great to be with you guys.
We're so happy to have you, and we would love if you could begin by telling us a bit about your context in Ohio. What are your roots there, and what is the context like?
Yeah, I'm really the only one with roots here. I was born and raised in Northeast Ohio in this area, and then went to college at Malone University, which is just behind me from where we sit right now, and was in ministry for a handful of years after that, after I graduated from Malone in 2001, and then was out of the area for 12 years. So Fuller for grad school, and then pastored on staff at a church in Memphis. Amy and I got to know one another through Fuller. We weren't together at that point, and she was in Chicago and I was in Memphis, and we connected and dated long distance and got engaged, and then started our married life together in Chicago. We were there for about 8 years, and this summer will be 10 years that we've been in Canton, which again is like home for me, but not for Amy.
So tell us, Amy, a bit about the story of Canton Abbey and Common Life Church. Like, what are they and how did they come about?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's hard sometimes to think back to when we first started the Canton Abbey. A lot of this came out of thinking about some new things around the pandemic. And at that time, right, there was a lot of opportunity for innovation. And so we just were thinking, okay, what do we do now, right, in ministry? What does it look like in our context? And so JR really had this vision for an abbey. And so that kind of emerged. And then from that, Common Life Church has come, which has been in its, I guess, current iteration for about 3 years now.
Yeah, at the time, Amy and I were serving as co-lead pastors of First Church of the Resurrection, which was the very first congregation established in our city. So Canton was founded in 1805, and this congregation was established in 1810. So we were functioning as co-lead pastors of almost exactly what you would expect, like an aging, dwindling, downtown historic congregation that actually had become unaffiliated. So like from any sort of denominational tradition. So that's a bit weird, right? A 200-year-old church without sort of a denominational affiliation. And so Amy and I came and it was kind of a revitalization kind of effort. And it was in God's providence just before the pandemic, actually, like December of 2019 is when we established the Canton Abbey, which was meant to be a way for churches, nonprofits, other entities to connect and to collaborate and to do things with within the city. Little did we know the pandemic was right around the corner, and it wound up being really advantageous for us to have this other kind of space to do things out of in a more collaborative manner. And then it was a handful of years later that what now is Common Life Church began to come together, and it was and is held by the Canton Abbey.
So you named what you founded an abbey. And for most church leaders, that's maybe not the first word that's going to come to mind when they think about fresh expressions or church planting. So can you tell us some about what drew you to that language and what does it mean for how you relate to each other?
When I was a grad student at Fuller, was the first time I began to sort of get some exposure to the history of like Celtic monasticism and the idea of religious orders and sort of sodalic structures to the church in general. And the way that I was exposed to what abbeys were and how they functioned, I just sort of had this sort of, back of mind wondering if the reality and the trajectory of Western culture wasn't ripe for a reinvigoration of these kinds of structures of church. And so like that's where it came from, and something that's like moldable, flexible, something that is ecclesial, but doesn't function the same way that a local church does, and says our job here is to try and discern how we can be a blessing to the realities in which we find ourselves.
We talk about the Abbey being there to create an ecosystem of blessing in the community of Canton. And so, like JR said, when we founded it, we really didn't know exactly what the Abbey would do in some sense, right? We just knew we wanted to create this space to just be available. And as it would turn out, the opportunities have just come for us to use that to create that ecosystem of blessing in our community. So it's been a great holding place for some of that kind of work.
Well, so share some more about that, because I think historically about abbeys, going all the way back in the Middle Ages and things like that, there was, a community that lived on site under vows, right? And, in permanent sort of life together, shared life together under a rule. Is that what you're doing, or what's similar or different? What do you actually do in the abbey in that sense?
Nope. It's not similar. I mean, so I like just to say, the main driving force, besides sort of like tapping into the spirituality of Celtic monasticism and abbeys as ecclesial constructs, what our recognition was that there's something going on in the groundwater of the place in which we inhabit that makes it really difficult for collaboration to occur between churches and Christian organizations. And we've just watched when people of like genuinely goodwill, who are lead pastors or like significant figures of Christian nonprofits, try to do collaborative work. There is this, it gets sabotaged and short-circuited, that people just don't really trust that there isn't some sort of other bottom line that at the end of the day someone has to look out for in sponsoring collaborative efforts. And so a big part of our setting forth of the Abbey, because it's not a physical space, and at the outset, like it was just Amy and I. Now that community has grown a little bit, but it was really just Amy and I, who we said, even though we're pastoring this historic congregation over here, we want to establish this other sort of thing over here that's not owned by this church. It's its own thing. That we felt like we needed to create a truly neutral space if people were going to come together, so that it was purely catalytic, setting a table so that the Abbey doesn't have a budget and doesn't have a staff. And so it really has no bottom line it has to look out for. So it has, all the freedom in the world to sort of create these common tables and spin work out amongst people that want to sort of work together. Now, we've also become engaged with something called the Order of the Common Life, which is also trying to tap into sort of like the charism of religious orders in the past. And I would say we didn't know it in 2019 when we established the Canton Abbey, but since we've become engaged with the Order of the Common Life and its own sort of DNA and imagination, there are ways in which now, like some of that is beginning to inform how we're thinking about the ongoing ministry of the Canton Abbey. But it's really kind of like a tool that we pick up and use as we need it, as opposed to it's not our livelihood. It's a space and an identity that we use within the city as God gives us opportunity to.
So tell us a bit about Common Life Church then, and how it relates to this Canton Abbey ministry.
Yeah, so just a little bit about Common Life Church. We do gather as a community under a shared rule of life. So that is a distinctive of our church, is that we share a rule of life together. Our gatherings are on Sunday evenings. We gather Sunday nights around a shared meal, and then gather together either around a worship night, or we study a particular book of the Bible, or are going through lessons on some particular topic, different kinds of things that we'll decide to do. But typically the kind of work that we're doing is around tables and conversation, dialogue, that kind of thing. But in a small community of folks, so like I guess 30 to 50 some adults and kids together, trying to discern what does it look like to live in the kingdom of God, right under the reign of the kingdom in our everyday lives. So it's not just that gathering Sunday, but there's practical ways we try to stay involved in each other's lives during the week, and ways of serving one another and serving the needs of our community as well.
Amy, so you serve as pastor of Faith Formation. And when you're thinking about what it actually takes to form someone in faith over time, what do you find yourself coming back to, and what can't be shortcut?
Yeah, great question. My my best answer is to say I find myself coming back to the Holy Spirit, uh, and just realizing, man, there's just no shortcuts to formation and change. I got to be on a panel over at Malone. They were interviewing me about, like, how do you, get quickly, like, get people to change their worldview? And I'm like, well, if tell me, because it just is not an easy or quick process. And I mean, a fool's errand apart from the Holy Spirit, right? So we try to just create the space for the Spirit to invite people. Part of living under a shared rule of life, right, with common practices, is meant to form people. We have a lot of families with children, and so often faith formation of children also forms the adults in that household as well. And so try to create resources for families to create spaces in their homes that are formative, again, for the whole family. So those are some of the tools that we try to leverage. But yeah, ultimately, I think just recognizing that patience is important in this kind of work, that it's a slow work, and we're really working to stay in step with the Holy Spirit as we connect with people. I mean, I know that's in my life, that's how it's worked. And so a big part of that, I think, for us too, is just modeling, right, and practicing these ancient practices ourselves, and inviting people to come alongside us on our journey.
So I'm really curious about the whole concept of kind of embracing a rule of life, particularly in today's America as Protestants. And it seems like this is a moment when a lot of people are, on the one hand, yearning for deeper roots, for a deeper sense of a shape of life that is informed by ancient wisdom, which I hear in part of your story. But it's also a culture that is always saying, do what you want. The self is sovereign. Don't be ruled by anything other than what your own desires, right? So to have a community where people voluntarily embrace a shared rule of life is super countercultural, right? And so, what are you learning about that tension? If you're experiencing it, are people finding it to be just sort of a relief to say, I don't need to make it all up on my own. I can find the wisdom of a shared way of life in a community? Are people, pushing up back against it? Like, what does that look like?
Well, there is this interesting dynamic in Common Life Church. We didn't try to start it. There were a handful of other people who approached us in the summer of 2021 who had gone through some deconstruction, had gotten disconnected from church in the midst of COVID, and others who are just kind of on the fringes of like maybe one foot out the door of being a part of church at all. And so we had the benefit of just responding to what seemed like people were actually really hungry for, which was a thicker sense of spirituality and community. So we haven't really had to sort of like force that on people or convince people of it. We don't do anything public, at least we haven't up until this point. And so we are a community of about 50 people between adults and kids, and everyone that's come has come by virtue of an invitation from someone else in our community who's just trying to say, here's who we are and here's what we're doing. And so the people who are coming, some who are baby Christians, some actually who are not Christians at all, others maybe who have been around the church for a bit, but they're kind of like done with church, or like church is normal, and they are looking for something more substantive that actually does bleed into the totality of their lives. Now that sounds a little utopian, I think, when I say it, so then there's also the reality of like, yes, people are sort of expressing a desire for a thicker way, of community and spirituality, but then the rubber meets the road of the way of life. And so like so the answer to part of that question is when it comes to the realities of what it means to inhabit a shared way of life, for sure, like we're bumping up against things because consumerism is just so built in to us as Americans. And yeah, so I mean, it's still I feel like very experimental in that regard.
Let me just do a quick follow-up on that. So just give our listeners and viewers just a sketch of what's involved in the rule of life. Like, you know, what are the vows that people take, or the practices that they commit to, and things like that?
Yeah. So this is also like directly sourced from our connection to the Order of the Common Life. And so we talk about 4 rhythms of prayer, rest, study, and work. And then 4 core commitments: the cultivation of spiritual friendships, the practice of hospitality, the sharing of faults and affirmations, and the pursuit of formational healing. So these 4 rhythms, these 4 commitments, we ground those in Jesus is talking about the great commandment to love God with all of your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And so we're saying this is the concrete way in which we're trying to respond to Jesus's call and invitation to us to learn how to love God and love others, is by giving ourselves over to this shared way of life. And so I don't know that we mentioned it here. Amy and I happen to be Anglican priests, though Common Life Church doesn't necessarily itself inhabit an Anglican identity. But our bishop, our founding bishop, Todd Hunter, would always say, we engineer the church from the mission field back, which is kind of a weird thing for an Anglican bishop to say. But like, that's just how he lived and thought. And so what we're doing is beginning with our community and the realities of their lives. And we're sort of engineering all that back into the realities of this shared way of life. And then architecting the way in which we're coming together with one another, both on Sunday evenings and throughout the week, by keeping those rhythms and commitments front and center. So they are the things that are actually shaping the way in which we're spending time together, the practices that we're engaging in, and things like that. So it's not like a mission statement back up on the wall somewhere. It's actually the filter through which we are creating what we do together as a community. And I'll just say, feels so weird to say, but like WhatsApp has been a big deal for us. It is like the thing that has taken us from a place of thinking about church as an event to church as like a family, that we are communicating with one another 7 days a week about things. And again, using the sort of filter or the lenses of our shared way of life for the way in which we're engaging one another in the world.
Maybe this next question kind of goes into this a little bit more deeper, JR. But so you've described Common Life Church as something of an accidental church plant that grew out of Canton Abbey's broader missional work. What is that? What has that maybe said to you about the relationship between forming people in faith and cultivating a church community? Does one come before the other? It feels like a little bit of like, is it a chicken and an egg, thought? And I'm curious what your experience has taught you about that.
Yeah, I'll just say something really quickly to that, and then would love to hear what Amy has to say about that as well. And just say, I mean, this is a first for me. Again, it wasn't planned, and we've not done anything like this before. With the Abbey coming first, and then just sort of relationships emerging around that, and then watching something grow up from the ground and come into existence that was sort of grafted then into the life of the Abbey. And so it feels a lot less like Amy and I trying to produce something that existed previously in our minds, and more like, oh, this beautiful plant just sprung up from the ground and it feels like it's ours to tend to. And I don't mean that exclusively ours, like we're part of a leadership team and everyone sort of in our community is sort of engaged in that work. So back to what Amy said about like being attending to the Holy Spirit and like sort of what's just coming is that sort of posture. And I would say it's really different than like trying to architect something out and bring it into existence. I mentioned that we don't do anything public. Also, this is not a source of like significant income for Amy and I. And so it's also our first time of like tending to the existence of a church community where we're not sort of counting on it for our livelihood. And that also has changed a lot of the dynamic about like how it functions.
Amy, what would you add? And I'm curious, as you think about, the kind of, part of the backdrop for me is also this interesting Celtic spirituality that shapes the life that you all have, a common life, which Celtic spirituality both has this sense of historically of like being rooted in a place, which is very much what you're doing there, but also an apostolic, the Celtic missionaries getting in their boats and evangelizing Northern Europe and things like that. So talk a bit about the kind of missional dynamics there too.
That's a great question. So I think as, the earlier question about, patience, right? And this idea of how long things take. We have been just trying to discern, hey, who's here, right? Who's God bringing into the room? Where are they at? What are they ready for? And then what's next? This has not been something we stepped into with a big long-term plan. I think our hearts are for our city and our community, and I see that in the people we have as well. But it's also been kind of a long discernment in terms of what does that look like? What does that look like to not just as individuals, maybe doing disparate kind of missional work and building relationships, but what does it look like for us to maybe corporately do that in a different kind of way? And so, so of course we've been equipping and blessing people to, engage relationally, right, with non-believing friends and family and prayerfully supporting them and sometimes doing service projects in our community and whatnot. But also, I think we're still in that discernment phase of like, okay, is there something else that God has for us that we would maybe more wrap our arms around together in a community? We do have a lot of our folks do live fairly close to one another. There's a couple different pockets of people in neighborhoods that are 5 to 10-ish, minutes at least by car. And so, so wondering, is there like an even tighter geography that God wants us to focus on, or another part of the community? But I'd say some of that we're still discerning and seeing, where's God leading us in this time.
JR, you've written and spoken about soulful discourse, the idea that communication is never just data transfer, that it always involves one soul connecting with another. How does that shape how you preach or teach or think about what happens as part of worship?
Yeah, so to reference again, like the charism of the Order of the Common Life that we've grafted into our community, Common Life Church, is this idea of learning how to notice and nurture the love of God at work in us and around us. And so when I talk about soulful discourse, I sort of mean like shifting a person, like your focus comes off of content and like onto a person. And that you're trying to respond not by getting your own idea across, but by like making a connection to the people who are right in front of you. And so preaching isn't something we do every Sunday. We do it with a fair amount of regularity, but like if and when I'm preaching or Amy's preaching or someone else is preaching, that idea of soulful discourse means that like what we're saying and how we're thinking is very, very rooted to the realities of the lives and circumstances of the people in our community. And so it's like, yeah, of course we want to do good, faithful exegesis on texts and things like that. But it's not sort of like a didactic kind of thing where we're trying to get people aligned. Like another way of saying it is like sort of our experiment in being at this expression of church is, can we create a Christian community that's not predicated on everyone believes exactly the same thing? Which doesn't mean doctrine isn't important to us. It is. Amy and I are Anglican priests and operate under the authority of our bishop, and there's a tradition in which we're operating and all that kind of stuff. But we're just saying we're cultivating the life of a community as a family, and everyone's sort of on a spiritual journey of learning. And the more important thing is the growth of one's soul along the way, as opposed to creating really fixed boundaries of in and out. So, I mean, it's a little bit of like centered set, bounded set kind of stuff for that. But also, just to sum up, when I say soulful discourse, it's really this posturing towards other people, wondering what is the state of this other person's soul and their capacity to receive and respond to what's being presented.
I'll just add that that it's a very unique situation in that when we are preaching, J.R. said that's not every week, we know exactly who's in the room and we know what they're going through in their lives. And so we don't have to preach with a generic covering to say, well, in case anyone's there, that it's their first time or I don't know them, but we just know who's going to be there. So yeah, as J.R. was talking, I'm preparing to preach this next Sunday, and it's equal parts, I think, praying over the text, but also praying over our community and saying, okay, how is this going to relate to what I know people are going through? And asking God, is there something that's like he's connecting there? So it's different than other, I guess, context where I've preached before, where you just have to be aware that you don't know who's in the room, right?
So I love the freedom that you have in creating this community to keep it. What I hear is something very simple and very focused. Institutionally seems pretty light. You're not creating lots of committees and infrastructure and all of those things, right, that so many inherited churches then get bogged down in. And it's very focused and trying to figure out how to actually be Christian community together in daily life and rhythms that are steeped in ancient wisdom. And I think many of us will look at a lot of inherited churches and say, gosh, somehow along the way we got so distracted from those basic things, and we somehow need to recover them today. So I'm curious for what would be your words of counsel to leaders who are working in inherited structures, inherited congregations, who maybe have accreted over the years many different things they're focused on that may not all kind of have that sense of shared life together in the way that you're describing. What would be some encouragement you would give if for pastors or leaders who want to maybe add some practices or simplify or kind of focus their church's life so as to foster a very formational, shared, intentional way of following Jesus?
My first thought is that this may not be something everyone wants, right? Or is ready for or open to. And so it's not something I think that you can force on a congregation, but it's meant to be a beautiful invitational kind of way of being. And so um, that my initial thought would be, like, hey, don't try to like impose this in a space that isn't ready for it or isn't hungry for it. But also, don't be surprised that there may be some hunger for these kind of spaces that you don't know is there. And so, what are some creative ways to invite and find those people, those core people that may be looking for this kind of challenge into a different kind of way of life?
Yeah, so I'll piggyback on that and say, and I think you can do that inside of what you have, like little small experiments and places of trying things inside, or the way that we did, creating auxiliary spaces like the Canton Abbey, and saying like we need a different kind of playground to like try some things, depending on all the sort of things that you have to contend with in this other reality. And then I would say, and I think Amy sort of like was alluding to this, is to say, like, we also can't confuse these things. So here's like the truth about our tending to Common Life Church is like, we have no idea if this thing can exist for 50 years. I mean, the way it can't right now. There's no thought to that. And so institutional preservation is a different ministry than what we're doing. And that's a good ministry. But like you can't function as a leader in a space that's about institutional preservation and try to do fresh expressions of ministry. Like the two things are not the same. So that's what I mean by creating like alternative space that like this doesn't need to be part of like the institution that we're trying to preserve. So I'm just trying to say like these are two different things. They both have upsides and downsides. Like we are not building something right now that we're certain can stand the test of time and generations. And for those who are leading in prevailing model churches, institutional kinds of contexts, I think grassroots experiments, creating alternative kind of space is kind of the best that you can do, but like to not try to treat that other space of ministry as to pretend it can try to be this thing over here.
So say a pastor or a lay leader would like to take, a first step in trying an experiment on the side. What would you suggest? Where would you suggest they start?
Yeah, I mean, I think the right answer is prayer, but to be not quite so pietistic about it, like really listening, both to the Spirit, and to the people that you would hope to see God's love move amongst. I mean, I fall prey to this as much as anyone else of like, I have really good ideas. Like, I think I should just go out and get after my good ideas. And certainly everyone else is going to want to respond to like my really good ideas. And I think the gift that God has given me in Common Life Church is like, nothing about this has really been my idea. It's really just been like coming alongside other people, listening to them well, and then sort of like responding to what we're understanding other people are, where they're at, what they're looking for. And now, we're still trying to be true to ourselves, right? Who we are and like God's calling on our lives and things like that. But I would say listening and responding and then experimenting your way into the future.
We were established in our community for a long time before we started this. And I think doing that good kind of community exegesis of knowing who's in my community, who's not in the church, right? And why not? And what are they looking for? And what would be a safe place for them to encounter Jesus? And that's going to look different depending on who you're hoping to reach. So thinking about those kinds of things, and how do I create that kind of safe place to engage that community, and how do I have support around it?
Well, Amy and JR, thank you so much for sharing your story and your wisdom with us, both reaching deep into ancient practices and traditions of the Christian church and models for thinking about ministry, but also doing that in a very contemporary and experimental way. And I think this is a moment when I think the church needs to do both of that, both that retrieving of roots and gifts from the tradition, but also finding new ways to express them. So thanks for being with us.
And to our audience, thank you for joining us on this episode of Pivot. To help spread the word about Pivot, please like and subscribe if you're catching us on YouTube, leave a review on your podcast platform, or share Pivot with a friend. We'll see you next week.
The Pivot Podcast is a production of Luther Seminary's Faith+Lead. Faith+Lead is an ecosystem of theological resources and training designed to equip Christian disciples and leaders to follow God into a faithful future. Learn more at faithlead.org.